Hello, everyone. My name is Elliot Nethercutt with NRRI, and I'm excited for our discussion today on the intersection of state decarbonization policy goals and resource adequacy needs. This webinar will explore the topic as it relates to the situation in California following the blackouts that occurred in the mid-August heat wave last year. I'm hopeful that we'll have a productive discussion today, and I hope it will be useful for other states as they develop and implement their own decarbonization policies and corresponding regulatory approaches. We have a terrific panel today that includes Arthur Havenstock, Carl Musin, and John Mora. I'm going to go ahead and provide a complete introduction for each panelist before they present. But as for the agenda, I'm going to kick us off by providing a recap of the August events. We'll take a look at the key findings of the joint CAISO CPUC and CEC report released last month, and I'll discuss California's resource adequacy constructs. From there, I'll explore how ongoing decarbonization policies have led to a relatively rapid transition to a more variable system. And I'll discuss why the transition requires enhancements to their resource adequacy approach. Next, I'll introduce each panelist before they provide their remarks and presentations. And from there, I'll develop some questions to initiate our discussion. And we'll have some open dialogue. But as for some housekeeping, I really just to avoid interference, we've gone ahead and muted all lines except for the panelists. And throughout the webinar, I'll invite you all to enter any questions into the Zoom chat box. You can direct your questions to the rest of the audience, or if you prefer, you can send them directly to Tom Stanton. And Tom, thanks for your help with that. And thanks also to Victor Arujo for helping with the webinar logistics. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some upcoming NRRI and NARUC announcements. One more thing before we start, please go ahead and email me if you have any questions or general feedback on this webinar. We'll be posting the recording on YouTube in about a month. And also be sure to check out NRRI's YouTube channel. It's got some great archive webinars on a variety of topics ranging from gas, water, electric, and telecom regulation. So I think we're up to about 40 posted videos now. Lots of good content there, so I hope you all will check it out and subscribe. So let's go ahead and take a look at the recap of the final root cause analysis of the event that was prepared by the California Independent System Operator, the California Public Utilities Commission, and the California Energy Commission. This report took almost 6 months to finalize, and there's a tremendous amount of useful data and charts, and it's well written and it provides clear explanations. So like all major load shedding events on the bulk power system, there are usually a long list of contributing factors. And of course, the entire point of a root cause analysis is to understand what went wrong so that policymakers and regulators and the system operator can respond appropriately. So according to the final report, climate change was identified as an extreme heat wave across the West that drove up temperatures along with electricity demand. And the demand was beyond the bounds of the CEC's energy forecast and beyond the planning targets used in California's existing resource adequacy program. The second factor built on the first one, which further highlights the idea that the change in resource mix led to the system with insufficient resources over a short period to meet electricity demand. The oversupply issues during the early afternoon and net load ramps in the early evening have become a growing concern in California since about 2014. So an extreme weather event like this one simply exacerbated those existing challenges. And as for the third factor, it relates to the energy market, as CAISO has recognized some market design issues, including underscheduling of demand in the day-ahead market, convergence bidding that seemed to mask tight supply conditions for operators, and finally the residual unit commitment process, or RUC process, was impacted by market enhancements made in 2014, and the problem emerged during the August events, ultimately leading to exports being cleared in the integrated forward market when they shouldn't have been. And as a result, exports actually increased between the day-ahead and real-time markets. The CAISO has since removed this problem from the RUC process. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on CAISO's market-related factors, but I would like to focus more on numbers 1 and 2 from the root cause analysis, which closely relates to the topics of this webinar. So let's go ahead and take a look at the timeline of events during the challenges on the California system last summer. I think it's important to understand that these events occurred during those 2 days so that we can sort of zoom out and discuss the broader issues, including states' resource adequacy constructs with a generation mix that has become increasingly variable. So the heat wave that hit California began on August 14th and lasted for 5 days. It was a 1 in 30-year event for the state. And between the 14th and the 15th, over 8,000 customers ultimately lost load for between 8 minutes and as long as 2.5 hours. On the morning of August 14th, the CAISO knew loads were going to be high, but the loss of a 475 megawatt plant in the early afternoon really kicked things into emergency mode, as the CAISO encountered challenges maintaining adequate contingency reserves that are required by NERC as well as WEC. And contingency reserves are really there just to protect against sudden loss of generation and transmission. And for the CAISO, while each system is different, CAISO requires at least 6% of the demand to be covered with contingency reserves. So at 5 p.m., conditions had still not improved, so the operator manually dispatched about 800 megawatts of reliability demand response resources. Now, this type of DR is required to respond within 40 minutes of dispatch, but ultimately less than 500 megawatts initially showed up in the first hour. And this amount was later increased during the 6 p.m. hour. But by 6:30, all DR had been dispatched, and yet high loads continued, and the system remained under extreme stress. To make matters worse, solar generation rapidly declined as the sun set. And so recognizing those conditions, the CAISO declared a stage 3 emergency at 6:38, and the system was nearing deficiency again in meeting its reserve requirements. Although the CAISO ordered 2 500 megawatt phases of controlled load shed, the 3 major utilities ended up responding with a little over 1,000 megawatts. By 7:40, the CAISO began restoring load as system conditions improved. The following day was a Saturday, and between 2 and 3 p.m., cloud cover caused solar output across the state, or across much of the state, to rapidly decline by more than 1,900 megawatts, while loads were still increasing. Once again, contingency reserves became an issue as they were approaching the minimal requirement. And at 3 p.m., the CAISO manually dispatched almost 900 megawatts of demand response, but ended up only metering approximately 550 during the first hour. And that grew to 729 megawatts during the 4 p.m. hour. So just as DR was responding, wind rapidly declined by about 1,200 megawatts. And to make matters worse, an erroneous California dispatch resulted in generators ramping down. That prompted the CAISO to immediately declare a stage 2 emergency, followed by a stage 3 emergency at 6:28 p.m., as the system was once again struggling to meet reserve requirements. With this controlled load shedding request, the IOUs ended up with almost 700 megawatts of interruptions. But it's also important to note that both days the CAISO was navigating potential impacts from state transmission system, which was also at risk due to numerous fires. And throughout the August 15th period, the transmission lines were also impacted by thunderstorms across the PG&E service territory in the northern part of the state. So how did the resources perform during these events? According to the root cause analysis, in terms of output, natural gas resources experienced the highest levels of forced outages and derates, at least in part due to the extreme heat, as higher ambient temperatures often reduce output for thermal resources. Although imports did not experience RA outages, the CAISO did attempted to transfer more, and transfer capability was actually reduced by nearly 650 megawatts. And this is partially due to congestion on the usual import transmission paths. So basically, more energy was trying to make its way into the state than could physically be delivered. And that's why the total import levels were less than the amount the state typically would have received. Hydro generation was also limited by a variety of reasons, including derates, likely related to the heat wave. But what's really interesting here is that wind and solar actually performed pretty much as expected. So this table shows a snapshot of outages for resources when demand peaked, as well as when the stage 2 and 3 emergencies were declared. But let's take a look at the actual generation performance on August 14th. So when talking about specifically output and performance, you can see that natural gas is really serving most of California's electricity demand during the emergency. So when demand peaked at 4:56 p.m., natural gas covered about 54% of the load, while renewables were serving close to 13%. So more importantly, after the stage 3 emergency was declared, total natural gas generation was able to increase output, while renewable output continued to decline. So I think the important takeaway here is the need to differentiate between derates and outages versus the time-dependent capabilities of intermittent resources like wind and solar. And that brings us to California's current resource adequacy constructs. The CPUC's resource adequacy program was developed in the early 2000s, and it's primarily responsible for identifying resource requirements, flexibility needs, and local and system-wide reliability needs so that the CAISO is able to operate the grid reliably. So an important takeaway and an important focus on the RA program are the planning reserve margins. Now, these PRM targets are critical in terms of their ability to establish monthly requirements for jurisdictional load-serving entities, and also for the Commission to make decisions about procuring additional resources to serve system needs. So specifically, the PRM targets set the capacity to serve the standard 50-50 or 1 and 2 peak demand forecast, plus a 15 to 17% planning reserve margin to address any unplanned generator outages that may occur. These targets are also instrumental for informing CPUC's procurement decisions. And as we talked about earlier, the 6% NERC standard is really required in many systems, but as for California, they plan for an additional 9% in terms of planning reserves to address forecasting errors and forced outages. And that's what you see on the far left column. In the middle and far right stacks represent what occurred on the 15th and 16th. And so on the 14th, you can see forced outages combined with actual demand exceeded the forecast, accounting for over 9%. But on the 15th, while the high loads were less of a problem, forced outages combined with larger fluctuations in wind and solar output created additional challenges for the system operator. So we also need to recognize that the chart here is built around the peak demand, but ultimately the stage 3 emergencies for both days and the corresponding load shed events occurred in the hours after the peak. And this is really another reason why the kind of analysis might not paint a complete picture of reliability, especially in variable systems like California. So we're seeing more often that wind and solar variability are leading to oversupply and undersupply that are occurring almost exclusively outside of the peak periods. The second issue relates to how to plan around more intermittent resources. The CPUC has really worked hard on improving methods for establishing or estimating the reliability output values for solar and wind over the years, but they have recognized that the output is still overestimated. The CPUC is continuing to work on improvements to their RA program that will likely take a more conservative approach for intermittent resources. Another potential RA improvement is to adjust the PRM assumptions so that they account for scheduled outages. So currently, the PRM approach actually assumes that scheduled outages will be replaced with substitute capacity, which you can see by the red and white section on the chart here on the 14th and the 15th. That did not occur during the emergency events. So in our upcoming NRRI Insights paper, I'll get into more detail on potential enhancements to the specific resource adequacy metrics used in California. But the idea here is the PRM approach, while it's still useful and informative, does need some updates to the various outdated assumptions. And more importantly, the PRM really should not be examined in isolation. The CAISO is already taking steps by including hourly analysis in its summer loads and resources reports. And the CPUC has also initiated a working group last year to examine enhancements to the probabilistic analysis within the RA program. So I'd say these are two very critical improvements. But with regard to the rest of the country, NERC is also looking at essential reliability service guidelines, and they developed those several years ago. Those guidelines essentially examine other system attributes like frequency response, inertia, and ramping needs. And John is probably going to touch on those a little bit later today. So before I wrap up here, I just think it's important to, again, recognize how much variability is on California's system. And it's truly impressive how fast this transformation occurred. Here you can see just in the last 5 years, the max contributions of renewables has essentially doubled, and California's RPS policies are really driving these changes. I think that's one thing that was not mentioned in the root cause analysis. The state's initial RPS was introduced in 2002 and was accelerated or expanded upon multiple times by the state legislature. So as regulated utilities continued to meet or exceed requirements ahead of schedule, this reinforced the idea that policymakers could continue to raise the bar and introduce more stringent requirements. And that's exactly what happened. Even the latest bill in 2018 sets the bar for carbon-free resources to 60% by 2030 and 100% by 2045. And so if this is going to be achieved, regulators, planners, and operators need to have complete understanding of the reliability impacts of even more system variability. And that must be informed by improved metrics. The joint report essentially indicates that California's system did not have the adequate resources needed to maintain reliability. And it's also important that we recognize that while the August heat wave was a regional event, no other states in the Western Interconnection ultimately shed firm load, although some areas did come quite close. So I'm going to finish up here by stealing an excerpt from the joint report. Probably says it better than I could, and that's that these changes in the resource mix and the timing of the net peak have increased the challenge of maintaining system reliability. Additional work is needed to ensure that sufficient resources are available to serve load during the net peak period and other potential periods of system strain. And that's really what the upcoming Insights paper is going to explore. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our esteemed panel by introducing Arthur Havenstock. This is Arthur Havenstock. Arthur brings over 3 decades of experience in developing innovative, robust solutions for complex energy and environmental law and policy issues. Over his career, he's held leadership roles in multiple clean energy companies and trade associations. His insights on markets, regulations, and policies stem from his work on behalf of government, utilities, developers, financiers, and other energy sector interests. Arthur has negotiated and obtained regulatory approval for the first of its kind solar and storage contracts, secured precedent-setting energy and environmental approvals for generation and transmission, and cleared obstacles for large project financing. He's also taught at energy and environmental law and policy classes and guest lectured at UC Berkeley, Stanford, and many other educational institutions. He also has a terrific blog on gridworks.org that relates to the topic today. So Arthur, thanks a lot for your expertise, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you and to be joining these wonderful panelists today. Why don't we go to the next slide? So GridWorks is focused on the decarbonization of our economy and recognizing that it is within reach. We convene, educate, and empower stakeholders who are working together to build a healthier, more equitable, sustainable, and affordable future for all. We facilitate difficult conversations and collaborations to determine the best approach to meet decarbonization goals, engaging policymakers, advocates, energy providers, and utilities to create a collaborative environment and build consensus to enable policy action. Next slide. California's Resource Adequacy program was born, as with much of its energy market structure, in the crucible of the energy crisis in 2001. There are many, many reasons for that crisis, but one of them was a concern that there was a lack of ability to ensure that there were sufficient resources that were available online to balance supply and demand. Let's go to the next slide. It's a typical load curve. Let's go to the next slide. And the initial thought, as is often the case with resource adequacy programs, was to simply establish a planning reserve margin. That's a planning reserve margin in California. It's roughly 15%. Let's go to the next slide. And in initial conversations, as we were developing the resource adequacy program, the focus was on a bottoms-up approach in which every load-serving entity's contributions to that load curve were determined on an hourly basis, and the resources would be added up to match the shape of the load curve. Let's go to the next slide. It quickly turned to a more simplified assumption that if you took a look at the peak on a monthly basis and you established that you had sufficient resources to meet that peak, you could do a top-down approach. Let's go to the next slide. With the presumption that with that top-down approach, if you had sufficient resources to meet your absolute peak, you had sufficient resources to meet all other peaks. That assumes that resources are generally dispatchable and that they could be shaped to meet that load shape. Let's go to the next slide. The problem, much like Ptolemy's geocentric model of the universe turned out to be the case, is that the world doesn't just work that way. And as we went through Copernicus and Galileo, we came to recognize that all the attempts to try to make the real world fit into the simplified model that we had with the geocentric universe created a great deal of complication and didn't really result in the kind of assurance of balance of supply and demand that we were looking for. Let's go to the next slide. Very quickly, California's Resource Adequacy program became much more complicated. We recognized that the transmission system had transmission constraints and considered adding a constraint, a different kind of product for resource adequacy for the different regions of the transmission system. Instead, we came up with a counting mechanism. There were, of course, local transmission constraints, so there are those two flavors of resource adequacy, system and local. Then we started recognizing that many of the resources, even in a largely dispatchable universe of resources, were resource constrained. They were use limited resources. And so a series of maximum cumulative capacity buckets were developed to ensure that the resources that each load serving entity brought to the table to match supply and demand recognize those constraints by having limited numbers of those type of resources. So to generally try to fit a simplified model into this much more complex universe. As time has gone by, things have gotten more complicated with variable energy resources like solar and wind. And now with the advent of significant quantities of resources that are capacity only resources and are not generating resources at all, like batteries, and how we fit in the ability of batteries to support reliability while recognizing that unless those batteries are actually charged with electrical energy, their capacity isn't necessarily going to help. And so making a better framework that would enable the wonderful attributes of our new range of resources provide the reliability we're looking for has become an increasing challenge for an antiquated model. Let's go to the next slide. In many ways, this convoluted process that we now have has been looks like and has been described as a Rube Goldberg device, where you have lots of different complications to try to achieve not a simple task, but the task at hand. Let's go to the next slide. The recent shortages in supply that occurred in California and resulted in the rolling blackout is a good illustration of how the problems have evolved since the time that the Resource Adequacy Program was set up. What's interesting is that when those rolling blackouts occurred, they did not occur at absolute peak. They actually occurred after that. So we had sufficient resources to meet the net peak, what had been considered the greatest stress point on the system. We didn't have sufficient resources to meet the net peak, sometimes called the shifting net peak, when solar started to decline in its production because of the sun going down and before other resources could be brought online. And so that's been recognized as a problem for quite some time when people have been talking about the duck curve and the need to address these changes in our energy supply. But it's something that our resource adequacy program hasn't caught up to. So even though the stress on the system in terms of absolute megawatts was lower than historical stresses that we met easily and lower than the stresses that we had on those 2 days, it was still a problem for our ability to make sure the lights stayed on in these instances. Let's go to the next slide. So what do we conclude from this? Parties and program leaders are very deeply concerned that the existing framework hasn't kept up to date, that we really want to remain focused on bulk reliability. Clearly, resilience and many other issues are coming to the fore when we think about reliability, but resource adequacy, at least in California, is likely to remain focused on maintaining a balance of supply and demand on the bulk power system. That although California has many other goals, this is such an important and challenging problem that we need to solve that we should be focusing on that and trying to complement rather than be a driver for clean energy goals. I'll note that that's in tension with the legislative mandate, which requires the California Public Utilities Commission to advance clean energy goals through the resource adequacy program to the extent possible. And what that means is very much a hot topic for debate. Another concern is enhancing integration with neighbors. California has always assumed that it could count on its neighboring states for imports to help meet California's needs, but hasn't had very good visibility into what's been happening with neighboring states. It has not generally tracked how the energy supplies of its neighboring states are changing and how the neighbors' policy priorities are changing those supplies and when those supplies might be available. We also haven't done a very good job of thinking ahead about climate and the nature of the stresses on the system that are going to be different in a future frame. In August of last year, we saw a west-wide extended heat storm that stressed all of the neighboring states and made it less likely that any of our neighbors would have excess to help supply California and keep the lights on here. It's clear we have to solve for a variety of constraints, yet we could just focus on the peak, the absolute peak, or the net peak when solar starts to go down. But there are likely going to be a variety of different kinds of stresses as our supply changes and as our demands change with electrification of transportation and electrification of buildings and other sectors of the economy and the changing patterns that we will see with climate change. We need to be thinking about a range of different stress points. Some have said that resource adequacy should be looked at on an 87-60 basis, trying to make sure that we have a sufficient balance of supply and demand for every hour of the day, every day of the year. Others have said that the returns are really quite diminishing and that there are fewer stress points than that, and that a resource adequacy program that tries to be so comprehensive would be unduly expensive. And that's another question, is the balance of cost and benefit. There are many who feel that given the relatively few problems that we have in the bulk power system compared to the issues with the distribution system and other needs for expenditures, that we should be making sure that updating the resource adequacy program and ensuring the reliability of the bulk power system doesn't consume disproportionate resources compared to the other needs of the system. We also have to think about metrics, whether capacity ratings will still work, and whether, given the changes in the technologies with hybrid resources and storage resources, and the extent to which capacity is linked to the kinds of conditions we have looked at historically and not necessarily future conditions, whether we should be thinking about energy only. Obviously, with what has happened in Texas, that is going to be a more challenging circumstance. But it's clear that energy has a role, at the very least, in addition to capacity, when we're thinking about storage resources. So our recommendations, looking at this series of questions, is to begin by saying what we want the program to do, rather than trying to create incremental patches. And the people who were involved in the discussion that we convened generally agree that we need to be more concerned about forward compatibility and longer term regulatory and market certainty, and less concerned about trying to avoid changes from the existing system, which again is patched and problematic. So we recommend a series of evaluation criteria to be considered in thinking about alternatives to the existing program and potential reforms. One is to simplify. And one question is, if we need to add energy to capacity, do we still need capacity? And if so, for what circumstances? Resource adequacy really is comprised of multiple different elements, from planning to procurement to performance and potentially even energy price. And we have to think about which metrics fit to which aspects of the program. And we need to plan for the transition and not just the goals. We've been very good at identifying what our long-term goals are, but not always as good at ensuring that we're going to maintain reliability and control costs every step of the way. It's clear that we need to increase the power supply, at least for those stress periods, and to be thinking about how we're going to do that. And by power supply, we want to be clear that we're also including responsive demand. And the potential for responsive demand was one of the remarkable things that came out of the August reliability events. Voluntary demand response, as opposed to programmatic demand response, was overwhelming in the gigawatts of scale. And there's no question that there's a vast resource that is out there to be tapped. Many aspects of responsive demand that are programmatic perform very well as well, but we can clearly do much better and maintain reliability at least cost, and it was greatly consistent with the potential changes to our system by maximizing responsive demand. The program should really enable innovation and competition, and that's been a problem for resource adequacy in trying to identify administrative capacity levels for technologies as they change. It needs to, at a very minimum, complement clean energy and consider whether it's possible to advance clean energy goals as well as equitable goals, and to be brave. Ultimately, again, forward compatibility counts the most. We are looking at a great period of change. We need to create a platform that is going to inspire confidence in investors and in developers and technology designers. And we need to be thinking hard about what our future system is going to be and how to create a resource adequacy program that will invite the kind of innovation that's going to reduce cost and improve performance, and as well as meet all of our variety of policy goals. So let's go to the next slide. We're very happy to help in whatever way we can to help move the ball forward throughout all these policy issues that we are facing across the country. GridWorks has been convening policy discussions in many different venues, and We're excited about the opportunity to engage with a range of stakeholders to come up with creative, long-lasting, robust solutions. Thanks so much for the time.
Thanks very much, Arthur. All right, next we have Dr. Carl Musin, and he is a senior advisor for infrastructure and regulatory policy at the CAISO, where he develops and evaluates policies to better align California's resource adequacy program with the state's evolving operational needs during the transition to a cleaner resource portfolio. Prior to joining the CAISO, Carl was an energy advisor to a former president of the California Public Utility Commission. And he also researched right here at NRI. So Carl earned his PhD in agriculture, environmental, and developmental economics from The Ohio State University. We are very fortunate to have some perspectives today from someone who works day to day at the CAISO. So Carl, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Thanks, Elliot. I apologize for the video. We'll see if we can get that up and running here in a moment. But again, thank you very much for having me here today. I appreciate the time that you've given me to speak. I want to go through a little bit about what the ISO is doing and how we are trying to evolve our marketplace to better align and better prepare the ISO for the future, and kind of what's driving some of those needs for changes. Now, first and foremost, there are really three primary drivers for our fundamental market reforms that we're working on. Obviously, the increased load and resource variability. We have, not just growing grid-connected wind and solar, but we also have a growing level of variability that's happening behind the meter. So for the rooftop solar connected resources. So making sure that what we have is a broader, more regional assessment and view of maintaining resource adequacy and adequate capacity. So again, trying to leverage the diversity that we have across the West to help us provide reliability. Obviously, new and emerging technologies. Used to be that what we had was a fleet of resources, gas, hydro, and nuclear. That has evolved and moving away from that kind of readily available capacity to capacity that is there during many peak hours and many critical hours, but may be variable based on the wind or solar production at the time, may have other limitations such as energy availability. Right now, the CPUC's resource adequacy requires 4 hours of duration from its resources to qualify for resource adequacy. So we're seeing just kind of a different fleet of resources than what we've had in the past. And then resource sufficiency, and what that means is, again, an evolving sufficiency. It's not simply looking at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in August and saying, do we have enough installed capacity? Kind of along with the emerging technologies, we are looking to make sure that capacity, that sufficiency, is not just meeting that 2 o'clock on a August afternoon, but also make sure that we have that capability and that capacity available at our net peak and the hours subsequent to that. So 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night when the solar starts to taper off, making sure that we've got sufficient capacity still available and able to produce to ensure reliability during those hours as well. Can we go to the next slide, Elliot? So for those of you that are not aware, have not really been in the California marketplace, it is a complicated place to work in. We have really 3 entities, though there are more, but we'll discuss 3 of them today, that are working in and have some level of jurisdiction or authority in the resource planning and procurement space, that being the ISO, the CEC, and the CPUC. And one of the key messages and takeaways I want people to walk away with today is that collaboration is key. If we really want to successfully integrate high levels of renewable or work with these emerging and evolving technologies, there needs to be a collaboration, whether it be across the ISO to local regulatory authority, or the local regulatory authority to the vertically integrated utility, this collaboration is key to making sure that the grid operator, whoever it is, for that transmission system, when the resources are coming online, they have a view of that and an understanding of the impact that those have. So again, California's RA program is built on a complex relationship that is shared between the CPUC, the ISO, and the CEC. We each have our own very unique and critical element to the puzzle that is California's resource planning mix. Specifically, the ISO right now, as part of our ongoing collaborative efforts, we're working on and leading the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative with the goal of trying to future-proof resource adequacy from our perspective, and working across not just the CPUC, but also the municipal utilities that we have in the state and other local regulatory authorities that we serve in our balancing area authority. So we have that. The CPUC has an ongoing process each year for resource adequacy, updating its program and trying to enhance its processes and rules to make sure that it's also trying to keep up with the evolving need of the system. Now, I do like to always differentiate and distinguish the RA proceeding at the CPUC with the IRP proceeding. The IRP proceeding really is looking out more 5-10 years into the future to make sure that load serving entities are building the resources that are needed to maintain reliability. Well, the resource adequacy proceeding at the CPUC is more focused on making sure that the capacity that has been built, that is existing, is under contract and shown to the ISO with an obligation to be available. So that's kind of how those programs work together. And then finally, the CEC is also a critical part of this, because they work on one of the hardest things in California, which is the evolving forecasting needs. Trying to work on more granular load forecasting techniques so that we have a better sense of what our systems need and how they're evolving with the resource mix, particularly the addition of behind the meter solar, EV charging, and the like. So they have a very daunting task to try and provide granular information about what the resource mix is going to look like moving forward. Let's go to the next slide, Elliot. Okay, so resource adequacy program must deliver a dependable, reliable fleet of resources to meet the operational needs of the transmission system in all hours. Again, I've mentioned this before. It's something that you'll continue to hear, but resource adequacy just does not mean single instantaneous peak. The load and resource mix can lead to a variety of different times and situations that can result in reliability challenges. So having a better understanding of the 24/7, 365 view of the world of resource adequacy becomes much more critical. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later when we get into the portfolio assessment. So the future RA needs, they need to really better assess and account for uncertainty given the increasing variability of loads and resources and extreme weather events. We saw that happen, and the events of August really highlighted some of that in California. And so we want to make sure that as we address this moving forward, that we understand better about how that uncertainty plays into our markets and reliability, and what tools we need to better address that. We also need to understand the impacts on reliability as the system grows more dependent on use and availability limited resources. And really what this gets to is the added element of not just thinking about capacity sufficiency, but also energy sufficiency, and making sure that when we put all the toys together, that they make a very well-functioning machine that can help the ISO or the system operator maintain reliability, regardless of what that portfolio of resources is. We also want to accurately and transparently evaluate and value the resources based on their contribution to reliability across all hours of the year. In California, historically, what we've really looked at is trying to create a variety of different RA counting rules for various technology types based on how they operate or what we think they're providing. We've also had to rely on some complex connections between resource substitution rules, so that RA resources that go on planned to forced outages have various incentives to provide replacement capacity to that. However, it really leaves the planning for those outages to the last minute, potentially. And there may be alternative ways to do that, as we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, how other regions in the country deal with some of those forced outage rates, for example. Then we need to assess not just the capacity that's out there, but the capacity that's shown as RA. So not just assuming that whatever capacity is built is readily available to the system, but that the resources that have that commitment to provide RA are available to the ISO and ready to participate in the market and be available for dispatch as needed. So again, looking at not just single resources or single instantaneous points in time, but looking at all the resources that are available and how they work together to provide reliable grid operations. And then finally, the improved load forecasts, which drive the resource adequacy needs. So again, working with the CEC to make sure that the load forecasts that we rely upon accurately and reasonably account for the expansion of behind the meter distributed energy resources, be they rooftop solar, batteries, hybrids of that type, or electric vehicle charging. Let's move to the next slide, if we could, please. So as I mentioned earlier, as part of our ongoing effort, the ISO's working on an ongoing effort, the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative. This is kind of our omnibus proceeding, where we're really looking holistically at our RA tariff and the rules we have, trying to work collaboratively and coordinate with the ISO and CPUC on evolving resource adequacy needs. There are several elements, obviously, to this one, because as RA is kind of all-encompassing in California. The first really, and one of the biggest elements, is developing the RA portfolio assessment. Now, I've mentioned this earlier, and so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this, though it is, because we'll get back to it again in some of our later slides. But this is really taking a look at what's happening in all hours of the day, not just the peak hours, to again make sure that we meet our operational needs for gross peak, net peak, the hours after our net peak when the sun is gone but load is still high. And we have a reliable assessment about how the fleet of resources shown to us to provide RA capacity is either adequate or not in terms of both capacity and energy sufficiency. The second element is really looking at how we ensure that the RA imports that we secure are not double counted in a variety of different balancing areas across the West, to make sure that they are uniquely sold and available to a given balancing area authority, and that they are real. Some of the challenges we've had in California, because we currently don't necessarily require all RA resources to be resource specific. There are allowances for not what we call non-resource specific system resources. These are aggregations of resources to provide RA capacity. There is significant concern that some of these are speculative, where the provider of that RA capacity may not have that physical capacity procured and available to them at the time of sale, and that they're trying to do that in the spot market or just a couple days ahead to get that capacity lined up. Now, we recognize that on many days that's probably an okay outcome, and there's not really a challenge to that. However, on those critical days, like we saw in August, when those imports dry up, as the capacity across the West begins to shrink, that lack of having that physical capacity procured and available to the ISO, that's when we start to suffer the consequences of anything that is speculative capacity. And so we need to make sure that the capacity that's providing RA from imports is real, it's physical, and it's uniquely committed to the California ISO, as opposed to something that can be technically or theoretically provided to multiple BAAs, depending on what actual needs look like. Okay, all right, looks like we've got the video ready to go, so I'm gonna pause for a second while we get that up.
Capacity margins of the Pacific Northwest, as well as the heat wave that we saw in August wasn't just limited to California, wasn't just limited to Southwest, it expanded over the entire Western region. And so all of that capacity was getting consumed basically in its native footprint. And if we didn't have some of the imports that we normally have access to, as Elliot pointed out, you know, they didn't have load shedding events in other regions, but they were pretty darn close. So making sure that the capacity that we're procuring, that we're relying on, is real, connected to physical resources with firm deliverability to the ISO to make sure that we've got real actual capacity. Reflecting forced outages in the capacity value, that's something that we see in other areas of the country. For example, PJM has a forced outage D rate in their capacity counting for resources where less reliable resources or resources that are in forced outage more often are eligible to provide less capacity into PJM's RPM market. In California, we rely on presently complicated replacement substitution rules that don't always drive or provide sufficient incentives to give the ISO back the capacity we need when planned or forced outages are happening. So we're looking at altering those to make sure that both forced outages have D rates to incentivize more reliable operation and better maintenance. And again, overhauling our planned outage replacement rules to make sure that if resources take planned outages, and we do want them to take the planned outages, that they do so at a reasonable time for ISO and load, and we have sufficient capacity to replace them. And then lastly, ensuring that the energy limited battery storage is available to serve our ISO needs. And again, we catch a lot of concern from some of the battery storage folks on this one, because our challenge is making sure that when we make a day-ahead dispatch award, that when resources move into real time, that we still have that energy we need. And inevitably, day-ahead to real-time forecasts change. And if we deplete a storage resource based on a real-time award and lose out on its day-ahead award, we can find ourselves either energy or capacity insufficient in our real-time market and forced to take additional actions. Okay, so let's go to our next slide. So increased reliance on limited resources amplifies the need to assess how resources work together. And I'm going to focus, the last couple slides here on our portfolio analysis that we've been working on at the ISO. And the reason for that is, again, making sure that as we think about resource adequacy, it becomes something bigger than 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August. So it's no longer simply sufficient to look at that peak. You have to look at and test multiple potential combinations of loads, resources, and hours to maintain both capacity and energy adequacy. Arthur showed some of the graphs of what single load curves look like. The challenge is we face 30 of those during any given, 30 to 31 of those in any given month, and they can be very different on any given day, Monday through Sunday. And making sure that the resources we have available to us can cover the gamut of those. And what that means is moving away from some of the more simplistic techniques that we've used historically. Historically, we, as Elliot pointed out, you look at your forecasted 1 and 2 peak, you say, well, we need 6% reserves and some error on top of that. Now we have to look at that and say, well, we don't know exactly what our peak load is going to be, but we also don't know what our load or wind profiles are going to be at that peak load. So let's create a test to make sure that we can see a lot of different tests of these. And so we've created and been working on a stochastic production simulation. Basically, that's a fancy way of saying we take a bunch of different load, wind, and solar profiles as well as a generating fleet, and we keep pulling from those to create a whole bunch of different potential futures to see what the probability that we will be able to serve load under different scenarios are. The challenge with this is that these types of stochastic models, they give you a distribution outcome. It's not a simple, yes, you passed the test, no, you failed the test. It's a, well, there's a probability you're going to fail, and are you okay with that probability? And so that gets us to the two big challenges that we need to, that need to be addressed with RA as we go forward. The first is to establish a defined reliability criteria, meaning how often or what is the probability that either an LSE or utility commission or an ISO is willing to accept the probability that there will be a load shedding event, or that the capacity that they're shown is insufficient and they have to take supplemental action. And then determining the quantity and attributes of capacity needed to address any deficiencies, be those in kind of that shorter term RA procurement or the longer term IRP horizon. Next slide. So the procurement requirements will determine the intersection between service level reliability, the cost of additional capacity, and supplemental ISO action. This graph here is the output that we found when we tested our July 2020 RA showings. And what it shows, if you look at where the blue curve intersects the vertical axis, is there's about a 2.5, 2.7% probability that there's not enough RA capacity. The question then turns to, is that okay? You know, when you look at for example, a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation, which is kind of an industry standard for reliable operations, you can say, well, that seems to be a lot higher than that. But again, the model here says this is the probability for supplemental actions, not necessarily loss of load. It could mean that we simply rely on other resources that we didn't procure. In months like March, April, May, that's probably not an awful assumption. In July, August, September, it may well be a very bad assumption. Backstop procurement is a potential option that we have, as well as firm load shed, which is, again, for us, a last resort. But again, it maintains system level reliability, but does so at the expense of service level reliability. So when commissions are looking at this and trying to figure out what is resource sufficiency mean, what does resource adequacy mean, thinking about what the probability that actions outside of their decision-making process are necessary will likely be an influence on those decisions. Let's go to the last slide if we could, and I'll wrap this up so we can turn it over to so finally, looking at, when we did our production simulation, looking at the frequency distributions of when we were seeing shortfalls, when we did not have enough capacity, we felt that was very helpful and informative to saying, if you've got a shortfall, when is it happening? For how long is it happening? What types of resources might be useful in filling these needs? And what you see here, these blue bars are what we saw if we tested and took out all the wind and solar and replaced it with thermal resources. And the green bars are when we were looking at kind of the RA fleet as we saw last year. And we see a shift. If you had asked, as Arthur noted and Elliot noted, in the early part of RA, you would have seen the deficiencies happening in the midday. And today we see them happening later in the day. The deficiencies, so you want resources that can be there as the sun's setting. How long they have to last? Right now, we're seeing shorter duration deficiencies in our studies. But as those start to expand, you start to capture that. You start to see that, and you start to plan for this. And then the frequency with which you need to use those resources. Can I get away with a 4-call a month DR program, or do I need something that's going to be really kind of an everyday option? Are also extremely helpful in trying to guide those decisions. So again, this all comes back to the idea that resource adequacy, as we move to greener fleets or more use and availability limit fleets, is more about how the resources work together and less about a single instance in time. And so this is how we look at, think RA is moving forward into the future, and how we're trying to enhance our system level reliability so that we can integrate more renewable resources and help California meet its energy policy goals. So with that, thank you very much, Elliot, and I'll look forward to questions at the end.
Carl, thanks so much. That was really great, and appreciate you digging into the real market side, as well as the all the work that you're doing there on the RA initiatives, and it's really informative. So I'm gonna move on here to our next panelist. John Mora is the Director of Reliability Assessments at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. He leads the development of NERC's long-term and seasonal reliability assessments. And John also oversees many special assessments on the reliability impacts of various federal policies. He's an expert on the evolution of really NERC's resource adequacy metrics, and is really leading the charge to ensure these metrics align with the changing resource mix throughout the country. So I will go ahead and turn it over to John. Thanks so much for joining us today, and please take it away.
All right, great. Elliot, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through clear, John. Thanks.
All right, great. I tried to put my video on, but it says you cannot start the video because the host has stopped it. So if y'all want to see my face here, you're missing out. There it is. All right, great, wonderful. Wow, what a great set of presentations so far. I'm kind of sitting back here saying I'd rather get into almost the discussion right away, because Elliot, Arthur, Carl, you guys have said all the points I really wanted to get across, and of course I'll go through my slides, but I'll really focus on some of the things maybe we haven't mentioned yet. But I think it's important that just kind of setting the tone. I agree with basically everything that has been presented. So if y'all were ready for a brawl here, you can tune off, because this is really about agreement. And Carl mentioned it, it's really, there's a coordination effort that has to happen, and there's a complex regulatory structure in California. The California system isn't really a California system. It's part of the Western interconnection. There's a Western interconnection regulatory regime with the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and they're of course part of the broader NERC and ERO regulatory scheme, of course with FERC as well. That looks at the entire North American bulk power system. It transcends even into Canada and Mexico as well. So really, I think it's great that we're all speaking the same language, talking about the same messages that need to happen. And so this is really kudos, and y'all have the folks on the call are our primary audience. This is in many cases, we're Carl and I particularly working on a lot of the technical challenges, making it happen from an engineering and technical standpoint. But of course the policies are really important. And the policymakers, for them to understand some of the challenges and some of the adaptations that we need to go through to ensure reliability going forward. And so I'll just spend a second saying, NERC is an interesting organization, where the Electric Reliability Organization in the United States. We have about 100 reliability standards, mandatory reliability standards that are in place. They range from anything from how operators need to communicate, cybersecurity, physical security standards, balancing standards, interconnection reliability standards, and those are mandatory enforceable. NERC doesn't actually develop them by ourselves. It's a stakeholder organization, and we work with the industry to develop those standards. Ultimately, they get approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And part of our mandate specifically says, NERC can't order the construction of any generation or transmission or facilities, but it is our responsibility and obligation to assess it. And I think that's the value that we try to bring to the discussion and to the industry and to the policymakers is the independence of our organization and of our message. We are strictly a reliability technical organization. We don't comment on policy, good or bad. It's more around looking at policies and trying to understand what the reliability implications of those are. And within my role as Director of Reliability Assessment and Performance Analysis, I get to look forward 5, 10 years out, seeing what the trends, emerging risks are to the bulk power system, but also looking back. What's happened? How's the industry, the system performing? What are the events happening on the system that we need to make sure it doesn't happen in the future? And then managing a number of stakeholder organizations that come together to determine what our next steps as an industry are. So go to the next slide. So taking even a 10,000 foot level for me is too close. So taking a 300,000 foot level, looking at reliability and kind of the definition, adequacy is part of it. There's two fundamental concepts: adequacy, which is mentioned. Do I have enough stuff on the system? That's where we do a lot of our assessment activity, but also operating reliability. And that's really where our mandatory standards fall in. And they're really all about making sure that the system's stable, that, when things shut down or come offline because they break or they trip off or for whatever reason, the system is stable. So, no instability, uncontrolled separation, cascading, voltage collapse. Those are the things that our standards really guard against. And then for an assessment activity, it's making sure these messages and the risks are known about the expected serving capability of the system. Next slide. So digging into a little bit on the Western Interconnection, and this was said a couple times, but here's a slide that shows some data. During the Western Interconnection heat wave event, again, it's the way NERC and WEC looked at this, it's really a broader interconnection issue. We did, like was mentioned, it's something that has increased year on year. We've seen the number of energy emergency alerts, there's 3 energy states balancing authorities can be in based on certain resource deficiencies that they see or certain energy constraints that they see. And of course, in 2020, 6 BAs were in an EEA 3 state. That's the dark blue box over there in the Western Interconnection, and that, of course, that's increased. So we've kind of seen this risk kind of coming over many years. Next slide. When we look at our seasonal assessment, NERC does a long term. We also do some seasonal assessments. So every summer and winter, we do a resource adequacy assessment to provide some information, guidance for policymakers around the expected conditions. Even that process is so baked into peak being the most severe condition on the system. And we're slowly learning, and especially in certain areas, that's not always the case. But we do take a broad look at the entire summer season. We also do a winter assessment. And when we look at the California area, it's not just CAISO, it's a California. We also include a part of Mexico here because we're looking at kind of a little bit of broader system. We do these kind of waterfall charts that really help understand what the risk is. One of the challenges is, our fundamental reserve margin analysis really shows that everything's usually okay. And as we've seen in the presentations before, that's the case. On peak, we've procured enough capacity. We've got the transmission established. We've got demand response. We've got all these things so that we perform properly on peak. But things happen in operation. And as Carl really said really well, there's probabilities associated with being able to have a system that can serve its demand and not. And so what's the right balance? When should systems be concerned about that? And it's kind of really easy to see here. If you look at the blue bar on the left, 63 gigawatts of capacity. You have the first orange bar, 52 gigawatts of demand. I should be okay for every other hour, right? And that's Arthur's point. But because of the types of resources and the assumptions that were really part of the reserve margin construct around, fuel is always going to be there, transmission is going to be there, demand is very predictable. That's changed over time. And so there's a number of things that happen. Generators aren't always working. They get forced out even when you need them. When you look into the shoulder periods, there's resource derates. Solar doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, and so there's some expectation that these resources may not be there. And so while our summer assessments still say, we're good on capacity for peak, we are starting more and more to highlight this. We release this every summer, every winter, so it's really a good reference for especially all the regulators. One of our internal kind of measures of success is how many times our reports can get cited in any regulatory filings, or how many messages we can get out, how many people we can talk to. The use of these reports to serve as an independent voice on reliability is a resource for all of you. So I appreciate that, and always can contact me at any time. Next slide. Here's a winter look. So again, when we looked at the reserve margins for the last winter, everything looks fine. But there is that chance that certain areas are reliant more on fuel, certain just-in-time fuels, and certain areas are more prone to disruptions with extreme weather. In this particular case, this northwest area has tighter reserve margins we've seen over time. And if you have a 90-10, a more rare type event, there's certain risks there, right? And so, from a California perspective, how reliable are my neighboring ties, right? Which I think is a question here that's in the chat that we'll get to, which is really important if we're relying on our neighbors to supply certain energy at certain points. Let's go to the next slide. When Carl started the conversation around using and deciding which metrics we're going to use to set and establish criteria. And this is really where it gets very complicated. There's a lot of industry standard type loss of load metrics, but each of them have their frailties and they miss some important information. In our biannual probabilistic assessments that we do every 2 years, we like the loss of load hours, and we like the expected unserved energy. And we believe the combination of those two gives us a good sense of the risk. And I'll show you some data on that. And Carl kind of went through this a little bit, but loss of load hours, for example, doesn't really tell you too much about how often some things may have, or the magnitude, but they can give you a good duration. On the other hand, expected unserved energy doesn't tell you about how often certain things may happen, but it'll tell you how much energy over the course of the year or month you might be expected to not serve. And I think that's an important point, which is there's always risk. There's always been risk. And so seeing some numbers, some non-zero numbers in this EUE calculation has been troubling for some regulators, especially internationally. Let's go to the next slide. Here's what we published in our long-term assessment in December, and a lot on here, but I'll try to help orient us real quickly. On the left-hand side is all of our assessment areas across North America, so you see them here. And in the two columns, we have the EUE and the LOLH measures. Right on the top there is the WEC California-Mexico area, and these are projections that go out for 2022 and 2024. And you can see here for 90% of the areas, there's a lot of zeros or very close to zero numbers, and those are basically less than 1% probability that they would see any kind of load shed event. When you get into the kind of the yellow area, you start seeing some low loss hours. WEC, even the Northwest for 2024, We see LOLH of 4 hours per year. That kind of puts you at somewhere between a maybe 1 and 10% chance, still below kind of this industry standard of 1 day in 10, but starting to get concerning. When you look at the wet California area, again, looking out 2022 and 2024 based on today's known resource expansion plans, it's getting pretty high. 55 low loss hours, it's greater than 10%. It's probably somewhere a little bit higher than that, but it starts to really, start thinking about probabilities and what state regulators would do with that information. You could have a great day at the beach with 80% chance of rain, right? And so it is a hard thing to get your arms around. And so it is multidimensional. That is one piece of information. There needs to be other pieces of information that inform the risk. I did put here a little note here because I think it's really fascinating. Across the world, folks are looking at, regulators are looking at probabilistic measures, and especially in certain areas that have really expanded their resource mix and evolved their resource mix much faster than even us. The only area in the world, at least based on when I put this together, that has an EUE criteria is Australia, and their criteria is 0.002% of the total energy of a particular year. And when you kind of do the math here, 2024, we're expecting about 2,402 megawatt hours of EUE, which is just about 4 times greater than the criteria we see in Australia. So it's certainly something to consider as we approach that time frame. Next slide. So we're looking forward. I also want to look backwards because it's part of understanding where the stressful periods of the system are so that we can plan better going forward. Industry, we really like performance data, understand the historical patterns. If you get a lot of that data, it can really tell something about the future. And this is what we call the severity risk index. And it's basically the Dow Jones Industrial Average for severity on the entire bulk power system. It tells you something, but it certainly doesn't give you all the details and not representative of every area in North America. But really quickly, it's calculated every single day. And so you have, this is 2019 SRI. Left to right is the entire year. Got some control bands around kind of what's normal and what's not. But it's basically an index that looks at how much generation was off for that year, for that day, how much transmission was out for that day, and how much load was lost on that day. And what we find is that the most severe, the most significant outages, the times in which the system is at risk the most, is actually during some of the winter months and not the summer, right? And we designed the system to manage the summer, right? So this is a kind of an interesting thing that has changed over time, largely to do with the types of fuels that we rely on. Natural gas, prime fuel that we're adding to the system, has very high forced outage rate in the winter time for a variety of reasons. Either the controls are very sensitive to winter weather. It's not as easy to steam generators, boiling water, or wind turbines turning. These are very complex machines, but also there's limited gas transportation in many areas. And so you just have no fuel, no contracted fuel. There's plenty of gas in the ground, but the transportation of that as a just-in-time fuel source causes challenges. So these are the little bubbles here. You see the top 10 most severe days that we see in 2019. The interesting one here is the third one. You see that in October. And again, this is a North American index. But number 3 was really driven by the wildfire-related transmission outages in the Western Interconnection in 2019. So it really drove the biggest index, drove the index in that day. Now, we didn't shed load, we didn't really have those challenges, but there was a lot of transmission that was out of service on that day. Next slide. And so, and I think the speakers brought this up really well, which is, and I think the actual question was that, what does it mean to be adequate, system adequate, not so much resource? So capacity and supply, still important. One of my mentors always said, reserve margins are always going to be important. You got to make sure we got enough supply on the system, first of all. So capacity and supply are certainly important. But energy and understanding constraints, every generator has constraints. Coal-fired generation, they got certain constraints associated with how much coal piles they have. Gas has constraints. Solar can't perform at night. Batteries, storage can't perform when it's charging. These are all things that need to be considered as we think about the composite system and the energy requirements. Fuel assurance is incredibly important. It was a pretty sound assumption about 10 years ago to say, we're going to assume fuel is always going to be there. That is not the case anymore. And if you think about a lot of the, even our probabilistic assessments, one of the things that they do, and one of the assumptions, pretty big assumptions that they make, is that events on the system, generator outages, transmission outages, are independent. But when you model dependency, it can really drive these indexes significantly and these metrics significantly. And so, what I mean by that is, it was based on machines breaking, right? Independent, right? One machine breaks, that's independent of another machine breaking. But if these machines are tied into one pipeline, and the pipeline goes out, well, there's a dependent common mode failure, right? So you really need to think about that and how that plays in, and make sure we got enough assurance on the fuel side. Ancillary services and energy, essential reliability services, as Elliot mentioned, really important to make sure the system can work, can remain stable. It's got to be resilient to extreme weather. They need to have attention to local resources. A lot of, and the engineers have done ourselves a disservice by calling it power flow. And normally, you think about power flowing maybe from its neighbor to one area, but it doesn't really flow in one direction. It needs to be pulled. There's a dance that happens, and you need to have local generation, particularly inside California, to be able to pull that generation into the area from its neighbors. And then you've got to have alignment with energy and environmental policy goals. That's probably a pretty new thing to consider. But if you're at odds with certain energy policies and you've got a lot of risk from generators that may retire, but you don't have advanced way of planning their retirement, that could be a big risk, big loss, chunks of capacity very quickly. And then what underpins all that is flexibility. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for your attention, and happy to take any questions. Thanks, Elliot.
Hey, John, thanks so much. That was terrific. And, you kind of mentioned earlier that it would be great to just have a discussion for the next 30 minutes or so, but we're coming up short on time a little bit. I know you all have just great expertise in your and insights in your individual domains, but I think if there's no objections, if we could go about 10 minutes over today, that would be really great, so we can at least tackle a couple of questions and leave time for my announcements at the end there. Is that okay? I'm gonna judge by your silence that that's no problem. So I'll kick it off here. I put these two together. I think we can try to maybe answer one of them. The first one is, how can existing resource adequacy constructs and metrics be enhanced to better measure the reliability impacts of an increasingly variable system? And then really related to that, and I think maybe we can focus even on the second sort of part of this, is how can these metrics be appropriately integrated into the development of future energy policies, like, for example, renewable portfolio standards, to promote a more reliable and steady transition to a decarbonized grid. So I think that's a good one, these two to focus on, and then we'll take some from the audience. But I'll sort of open it up and leave it to you all who wants to jump in and start us off here.
Good
So
question.
I can just chime in and start. You know, I think my last slide probably is kind of the thing that I would turn to answer this, which is being able to have some sort of way to have constraints and considerations, criteria within that construct that assure certain services. And so it's not so much, so capacity important, energy important, reserves, ancillary services, flexibility, flexible resources. Having a construct that assures that we're incentivizing those services versus only focusing on capacity, I think is probably the best thing we can do.
Yeah, Elliot, this is Carl. I would echo John's sentiments there. As we've started looking at resource adequacy in the forward-looking space, and again with the understanding that the actual resources that are relied upon and procured matter, the RA targets at some level become not a point but goalposts, between which, you know, you maybe put the ball through the upright and get your 3 points, but how well they work together is the ultimate test of that. So you get your showings come in, or your procurement happens, and they have those upfront requirements. From a regulatory standpoint, that's necessary. A load serving entity needs to know when it comes to reports, utility commission to say, look what I've done, that has guidance that says thou shall do this, and you know, we can deem it just and reasonable, or used and useful, whatever the criteria you want to apply. But then when we look at afterwards, like, okay, you met the standard up front, but they don't play quite right together, so we need to do a little bit more. There needs to be that opportunity to say we've got an upfront standard and you've met it, and the fact that we need to do more still exists. So trying to provide both the regulatory assurance that their procurement is happening, as well as the additional opportunity for supplemental procurement and actions.
I'd absolutely agree with both John and Carl, and I think you're making excellent points. I do worry, though, that from a market participant perspective, looking at the complexity we already have, we have to think about whether, and I was catching on your existing resource adequacy constructs, we have to ask whether the existing resource adequacy construct is the right construct, and whether we're better off with a different construct rather than adding complexity to our existing construct. You know, the California construct is notoriously complicated, isn't creating incentives for enhanced performance or introduction of new technologies that would allow for enhanced performance at lower cost or greater integration across the West. And because of its complexity, I think that it's harder for players outside of California to really interact and to offer the maximum value to California, or vice versa. As we move into a different future, we're going to see greater need for interaction. There was a question in the chat about the need for new transmission. So, you know, I think there are lots of interesting proposals that are happening in California right now to be looking at different conditions. PG&E is looking at slices along the curve. There are some all hours approaches, and of course the ISO with its resource adequacy enhancements is looking at all hours. I think we have to sit back and say, okay, what problem are we trying to solve? What are the market mechanisms we can use to more simply get the performance and costs that we need to solve those problems? And that may not be the existing construct.
Yeah, that's interesting points. And I mean, policy moves slow, right? It takes time. And then you have the cumulative impacts that sometimes lead to unexpected outcomes. And then, on top of that, you layer a commission and then you layer a complex market on top of that. And you just, Carl, you mentioned earlier that Kaiser is working on a sort of stochastic modeling to examine sort of serving load under various scenarios. I was wondering if you might elaborate on how that's going to sort of line up with the CPUC's RA program.
Yeah, so that's a very good and complicated question, Elliot. So right now, as I noted in my previous comment, one of the questions that load serving entities want is to know that when they go before the CPUC, who sets their procurement requirements and kind of lays them out, says, how have I done? That the PUC will look at them and say, you've met the requirements that we've set out for you. But because in the ISO, what our requirements are to do is to manage the 3 major IOUs in California, the community choice aggregators, the municipal utilities, as well as the energy service providers, we have to bring all of that together and say, okay, we've got all this demand response storage, thermal, hydro, wind, and then say, okay, because there are different jurisdictional entities that have slightly different requirements and procurement targets and objectives, what happens then? So what we try to do is try and provide accounting rules for the resources to say, if we've got this single metric of 15% forecasted peak, that a PG&E or Southern California Edison can go to the CPUC and say, here's what we've done, and meet that requirement, meet that obligation. Oh, that reminds me, I forgot to ask this question beforehand, Elliot. Are there any CPUC commissioners or decision makers on the call today?
Yeah, I can't tell you who at the moment, but yes, we do have some, particularly from the Western states, but yeah, throughout the country.
I'm particularly interested in the California PUC just because I'm going to need to talk to you about that. I forgot because I'm subject to ex parte rules potentially on some of this stuff. So did not think about that as you asked the question, but I guess I've stepped into it already, and it is being recorded. So, but again, trying to provide guidance upfront to allow them to meet RA requirements, while at the same time allowing the ISO to have backstop authority if the requirements or the resources that are shown to us don't necessarily synergize correctly to allow us to maintain RA or expected reliability.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, I didn't mean to get you into dicey territory there, but I appreciate the explanation.
All right.
Are there any other sort of last remarks from any of the panelists here? I think we'll start to shut this down here. I'll start with you, John. Any wrap up comments?
I think what I really wanted to say is, all eyes are kind of on this, are on California and on the Western Interconnection. Not to put too much pressure on Carl and his CPUC and all the other regulators there, but this is really setting up the groundwork for other areas to be able to evolve their resource mix. Without having these policies and the right incentives, whether it's market or IRP type areas, it's going to be really difficult to bring on the types of renewables that our policies desire. And so, especially when you're thinking about transporting that energy across state lines into potentially different interconnections, potentially trying to build large-scale transmission, and not find ourselves constrained the way, all our eyes are on Germany too, in them trying to be able to unleash their renewable potential. And they find themselves very constrained. And so it's really important that we're able to move this forward and have incentives and policies that allow us to move this power around reliably, economically, and achieve these carbon reduction goals.
Thanks a lot. And how about you, Arthur? Any concluding remarks?
Sure, two things. One is that most of what we're spending time talking about today and in many of these proceedings it's all about proxies. What are the proxies that we're using for reliability? How do we use those proxies in four different ways: planning, procurement, performance, and then increasingly, and this is a hot topic in California, price. What's the relationship between what we're paying for the capacity world on the energy pricing? And is there a relationship? And so I think we need to think about whether the proxies that we're using are well suited to the objectives, and whether some of those objectives maybe are better off using different proxies. Ultimately, what customers use, what the energy system manages, is energy. And the closer the proxy gets to what we're actually using and managing and buying, the more simple it can be, the more efficient it can be, the more likely it is that we're going to get closer to what we want. So we should be thinking about whether energy sufficiency should be, it's clear that it needs to be considered. The question is, when do we consider capacity? When do we consider energy? When do we consider hybrids of both?
Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. And how about you, Carl? Any final remarks?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing I'd like to put forward is, first and foremost, one of the points I made in my presentation is collaboration is key. Between the policy and decision makers, be they the state legislators or the public utility commissioners, working with the transmission and system operators to know what potential impacts policy decisions can have on the reliable operation of the system, how you maintain a portfolio that is balanced and provides a least cost means of reliable operation. And I think the second point that I put forward is, as we do move forward to thinking about greener or alternative fuel sources for providing these reliability services, moving past that single metric into one that is a little bit more probabilistically based and takes into account some level of risk, such that we have an understanding of how much probability of shortfalls are we willing to accept relative to the cost that it would incur for a jurisdictional ratepayer, and using those to kind of balance and guide the directions we make in the policy decisions we make. And hopefully what we show here in California over time is that but for a single hiccup, we can achieve very high levels of renewable integration and do so very reliably. So again, Elliot, thank you very much for having me on, and thank you to the folks that have spent the portion of their day listening to us.
Yeah, thanks so much to John and Arthur and Carl. Thank you all for taking the time. This has been a really great presentations, great discussion. I'm going to just wrap things up here with a couple of announcements, and then we'll conclude. But as I mentioned, I've been working on a NRI Insights piece with Chris Devon. He was formerly at the CAISO and still very much involved in resource adequacy in the state of California. So we're still working it through the production process, but as soon as it's posted, everyone who signed up for this webinar will receive a link to that. So next, I want to just mention that my colleague Catherine Klein will be helping organize a webinar in March, and that's going to look at the water energy nexus. So certainly hope you can show up for that one. It'll be March 17th in the afternoon. I also want to direct all of those who are interested in state responses and various actions states are taking in response to the pandemic. You should take a look at our, really NARUC site that NRI has been supporting. It's a really useful tools on there that kind of show how all the states are responding, state commissions especially, and the impacts to the utilities they regulate. I'd also like to bring your attention to NRI's regulatory training initiative. We've got the next one coming up in February. It'll be February 16th to 18th. And the RTI is really a terrific resource for those of you who haven't heard about it. Anyone that's interested in getting a better understanding of regulation at the state level should definitely check it out. Next, NARUC Winter Policy Summit, that's going to kick off tomorrow and continue through Thursday of next week. There are some really great panelists this year, and I know we can't meet in person, but Michelle Malloy has done a really terrific job making sure these events are interactive and entertaining. So be sure to register for that if you haven't already. And then next, I won't go through all of these, but the Center for Partnership and Innovation at NARUC has got a lot of webinars coming up. Definitely check those out. There's some more information at naruc.org/CPI. So with that, thank you all again to all our panelists. Really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Thank you, Elliot. It was a real honor, and thank you, other panelists. It's Carl and Sean. It's great to see you.
Thanks, guys.